This video covers the digestive system. The learning objectives that we'll cover include listing the organs of the digestive system, the layers of the digestive tube, the role of each of the organs in digestion and absorption, as well as regulation. So first we'll list some of the organs of the digestive tube and some accessory organs. First, I just wanted to mention the functions of the digestive tract, of course, are ingestion, mechanical and chemical digestion, mostly using enzymes, lots of secretions of things, and then we need to absorb all the nutrients, and finally excretion. So this is a list, if you want to pause it, is sort of the anatomical list of our digestive tract, starting in the mouth and going all the way to the anus. It's somewhat of a continuous tube, and then we have the liver and pancreas, which help secrete some things into the intestines. So we'll start with the esophagus, and of course the esophagus leads from the mouth and the pharynx, or throat, all the way down to our stomach. Stomach's like a big pouch to mainly store food and just kick off digestion. Next we have our small intestine, which is divided up into the duodenum, the jejunum, and finally the ileum. The small intestine leads into the large intestine. The large intestine is often just called the colon. It includes a pouch called the cecum, the little tiny appendix. At the end of that large intestine is the rectum and the anus. The ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon are the parts of that large intestine. The liver actually helps secrete, with the help of the gallbladder, bile into the digestive tract at the duodenum. And so we'll talk more about bile, but bile is important for digestion of fats. The pancreas also secretes into the duodenum. The pancreas secretes bicarbonate and also digestive enzymes, which we'll talk more about as well. So basically, food starts up in our mouth and our pharynx, travels the digestive tract, sort of slowly being pushed along by muscular contractions. Most of the digestion and absorption occurs in that small intestine, and then finally the food ends up being compacted, and what isn't digested then is excreted as feces. So basically our digestive system is this long continuous tube that turns food into poo, all the while digesting what we can and absorbing materials and nutrients and water, ions, and absorbing those into the body. For a little more anatomical view of that tube, you can see how it's wound around in our abdominal cavity, all the way from the top of the stomach to the anus. And the liver and the gallbladder and pancreas also help secrete into the duodenum. A little bit more about digestive system anatomy. So remember, in our abdominal cavity, lining the inside of our abdominal wall in our abdominal cavity is this parietal peritoneum. So the parietal peritoneum is shown here in green. That parietal peritoneum is a nice sort of protective cover on the inside of our abdominal wall, and also the back abdominal wall. And then actually lining and covering our actual abdominal organs is another layer of peritoneum called the visceral peritoneum. And between those two layers is the peritoneal cavity, or peritoneal space, with a tiny bit of fluid. When this visceral peritoneum folds over and holds and anchors our digestive organs, we call it mesentery. So it helps organize and anchor our intestines. We also have this greater omentum, which is a fat apron composed of a double layer of visceral peritoneum, and that's probably for protection. Also, we have some organs that are retroperitoneal, meaning they're behind the behind the parietal peritoneum at the back of our abdominal cavity. Things like the pancreas, duodenum, aorta, and kidneys are in that retroperitoneal space, kind of stuck on the back of our abdominal wall. And again, we talk about mesothelioma just because many of those organs are covered by mesothelial cells. Our next learning objective is to describe the anatomy and function of the layers of the digestive tube. So here we can see in a video, I believe this is a digestive system of a pig, and it really is one continuous tube once you get to the esophagus. and it travels all the way from the esophagus to the anus as a continuous tube. We also have that mesentery. This is this connective tissue which helps anchor and support the digestive tube. And that mesentery also has lots and lots of blood vessels and nerve connections that go to our back abdominal wall. And from this video, you can see how long that tube really is. I'm not sure how long the pig anatomy is compared to humans, but again, very, very long tube, all wound up, coiled, and organized in your abdominal cavity. So that digestive tube is made up of tissue layers, just like all the other organs we've talked about. We'll find epithelium, connective tissue, lots of muscle, and nervous tissue as well. So we'll start with the inner lining of our digestive tube, and we call that the mucosa. It's mostly connective tissue with a tiny little layer of epithelium. So the epithelium, of course, covers and lines the inside of our mucosa. So we have connective tissue supporting that epithelium. Most of the digestive tract is simple columnar epithelium that lines everything from our stomach almost to the end of the rectum. Where we have our esophagus and our anus, we're going to need more stratified squamous epithelium for abrasion. So most of our digestive tract is simple columnar, except for the input and the output. Also, that connective tissue of the mucosa has lots and lots of capillaries and venules and blood vessels and even lymphatics. And those are going to be the blood vessels that pick up our nutrients and things that we absorb. The next layer in our digestive tube is mostly connective tissue, and that's called the submucosa. The submucosa has lots of connective tissue supporting space for things like blood vessels and glands and also neurons, again supporting our digestive tract and our digestive tube. Then we find a very thick layer, and this circular layer of muscle. Most of the time in our digestive tract it's smooth muscle, and this is called the muscularis externa. So these circular rings of smooth muscle are going to help contract and move stuff along our digestive tract, and also mix food as well. So again, most of the time it's smooth muscle, and we call that the muscularis externa. Also found embedded within these layers of our digestive tube is the enteric nervous system. These neurons are actually found right outside the submucosal layer and sandwiched in the smooth muscle of the muscularis externa. And that enteric nervous system is really the gut's own nervous system. And these neurons are important for regulating local and regional activity of the digestive tract. And there's two layers. There's a longitudinal layer on the outside and a circular layer of smooth muscle more interior. And then finally, wrapping around and protecting the outside of this tube is going to be some connective tissue and epithelium, and this is called the visceral peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum, again, is going to have mesothelial cells on the very outside. So this helps sort of anchor and support and cover our digestive tube. So the visceral peritoneum is sometimes also called the serosa. That simple squamous epithelial lining on the outside is our mesothelial cells. And then traveling within this sort of sandwich of visceral peritoneum are going to be blood vessels and nerves and even lymphatics. So we call that fold of visceral peritoneum that anchors the tube mesentery. And so we can see blood vessels that would be coming back from, originating from our aorta and things like that, going out to our digestive tube. We can see lymphatics coming back towards that mesentery sheet. We would also see autonomic nerves and neurons traveling in there as well. So to and from our digestive tube is carried through the mesentery. All right, and that's pretty much the tube, including the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and even the large intestine. Next, we want to explain the role of each of the organs in digestion and absorption of our foods. Remember, our food are things like fats and proteins, carbs, water, ions, minerals, and vitamins. So we start our journey off in the mouth, and the main thing helping for digestion is going to be the salivary glands. And the salivary glands, we have the parotid gland, the sublingual gland, and the submandibular gland shown here. They secrete saliva, and well, what is in saliva? Mainly water and some ions to help lubricate, but then also we have digestive enzymes, which are proteins that can break things down. So lipase for fats, amylase for sugars and carbohydrates. We also secrete some bicarbonate in that saliva, and bicarbonate can actually neutralize by binding to a little hydrogen ion, and so it neutralizes acid to help raise the pH in our mouth. One of the things we find in our mouth and our teeth are some bacteria. Some are good, but some can also cause cavities or dental caries. The acidity of the active little bacteria may decay away the enamel and the material of your teeth, and sometimes those bacteria like sucrose and sugary things in order to metabolize them, and this contributes to the acidity. So the autonomic nervous system regulates our digestive tract, including those salivary glands, and can activate them when you're eating or even just thinking about food. I want to talk a little bit about swallowing, which involves your oral cavity and your pharynx and your esophagus. It's basically a voluntary action that turns into a reflex. And so the part that you control is really just this very initial part, and then it's a reflex that gets it all the way down. So you start the first part, which is your tongue, which is skeletal muscle. Once your tongue pushes that food up against the top of the pharynx, it initiates a reflex that squeezes skeletal muscle and then eventually loosens and then squeezes that esophagus. So the oral phase is the only portion that we control when you push your tongue up against the roof of your mouth. This pharyngeal phase is a reflex that's housed in the medulla oblongata that signals to skeletal muscle in your pharynx to help squeeze that food back into your esophagus and not your airway. And then the esophageal phase is sort of like this peristaltic wave which pushes the food all the way down into your stomach. And once it reaches the stomach, now we're really going to start some of the digestive activity. One of the things that it must pass through to get into the stomach is the lower esophageal sphincter, or LES. So that lower esophageal sphincter must relax in order for the food to get into your stomach. One of the things that might happen is if any of that stomach acid makes it through that sphincter and into your esophagus, you can start to get inflammation and pain and heartburn in your esophagus. So the control of that lower esophageal sphincter probably relies on the autonomic nervous system and the enteric nervous system, and chemical signals like acetylcholine and nitric oxide, and maybe even hormones from organs like the stomach that can either tighten or loosen or relax that sphincter. And some drugs, for example, Viagra, can stimulate nitric oxide, can cause things like heartburn. So too much acid reflux can cause this chronic inflammation of your esophagus, which can sometimes cause this chronic heartburn and maybe even lead to things like cancer in the esophagus. The stomach's job and role in digestion is really as a storage pouch. So you can eat a lot of food and it can sort of stay and sit in the stomach and slowly be parceled out to our duodenum. So the stomach can also relax to accommodate a lot of food and change its shape. So that's an active sort of relaxation of the smooth muscle of the stomach. The stomach can actively contract and help mix that food. So we call contraction of our digestive tract motility. So that motility is going to mix up that food, and then every once in a while it'll squirt a little bit of food through that pyloric sphincter and into your small intestine. So the pyloric sphincter is the exit from the stomach to the small intestine. And it's important that that be regulated so you don't get too much food moving out of your stomach into the small intestine. The stomach also does some digestion using acidity. So by making the lumen of the stomach very acidic with a low pH, that will help digest the food. It really denatures or unfolds the food, especially proteins. The stomach cells also secrete a digestive enzyme, which is really just a protein that can chew up and break apart proteins, and that digestive enzyme is called pepsin. But pepsin and acidity really aren't super important overall to digestion, so the stomach really is important as a storage pouch, though. The other thing the stomach has and needs is protective mucus, and that protective mucus will protect those little epithelial cells of the stomach that make things like pepsin and acid, but it will protect them so they don't get digested, and really just the food is what begins digestion. So let's zoom in on the stomach wall a little bit. Again, we see the layers we learned earlier, right? We've got our food up there. So the first inner layer of our wall of our tube in our stomach is the mucosa, and it has the simple columnar epithelium, which we're showing here in purple in outline. So that simple columnar epithelium is supported by connective tissue, which makes up our mucosa. And those little cells in there are going to make things like the acid and the pepsin. And then we go to the muscularis externa in the stomach. It's actually 3 layers thick because the stomach's so strong and powerful at contracting and mixing. If we zoom in even more, we can see that simple columnar epithelium. It's just 1 cell layer thick. We have parietal cells, which actually have little protein pumps that can actually move hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient into the lumen of the stomach. And those little hydrogen ions then are the acid that decreases the stomach's pH, which helps a little bit in unraveling food and helping digestion. So that's hydrochloric acid, or what those little cells actually pump into the stomach. If you have too much acid and you want to stop that acid because maybe you have ulcers or things like that, you might take a drug like Prilosec, which actually blocks those little protein hydrogen pumps or proton pumps and shuts down their activity. Another cell in the lining of the stomach, in those simple columnar cells, are chief cells. Chief cells make pepsin. Pepsin is a digestive enzyme which helps break down proteins into smaller and smaller components. It's inactive inside the cells as pepsinogen, and then it becomes active once it's in the acidic stomach. The other thing are some cells in those simple columnar cells will produce mucus and bicarbonate, which will be protective from that acid and from that pepsin. And that's important so that your stomach cells are protected. You might wonder what causes ulcers in our stomach. Well, probably one of the primary causes of ulcers are bacteria, and the specific bacteria are called H. pylori. And it was discovered that these bacterial infections cause inflammation and damage to the mucosa and those little simple columnar cells, and that can cause sometimes a bleeding ulcer if it's bad enough, where the blood vessels in the mucosa or even the submucosa bleed out. And so basically an ulcer is like a wound in the lining of your stomach. The other thing that can cause ulcers is our NSAID drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Advil and aspirin. They decrease the protective mucus production, and they decrease blood flow that helps protect the mucosal layer. And so that damages those simple columnar cells again and can cause ulcerations in the lining of the stomach. Again, that bleeding can sometimes be serious or even deadly. So how do you treat an ulcer? Well, one would be to use antibiotics to kill the H. pylori. Also, various drugs stop or slow the stomach acid production. So antibiotics to get rid of H. pylori. Prilosec and the other hydrogen pump inhibitors can block the acid production and secretion. There's also the problem if you're just taking too much aspirin and Advil is to slow down how much you take. So the 2 primary causes are bacteria and then taking drugs like aspirin and Advil too much. I also wanted to mention that the stomach cells make hormones too. So they make a couple of famous hormones, gastrin and ghrelin. Gastrin actually is interesting in that it travels the whole body in the bloodstream. So it's made by the stomach. It travels up to the heart, to the lungs, back to the heart, and its target, or one of its intended target, is the stomach itself. And so it increases motility and acid secretion of those little stomach cells. The other hormone is ghrelin. Ghrelin actually travels the body, and one of its main targets is the hypothalamus, and it stimulates neurons in your hypothalamus so that you feel hungry. So again, the stomach is actually able to affect the way the brain feels about hunger. I also wanted to mention that some of these hormones and signals can actually control gastric emptying. So because the pyloric sphincter controls gastric emptying into the duodenum. Some of these signals may even be from the small intestine to the stomach and let it know when it should actually loosen that sphincter and allow more food into the small intestine. So once we're in the small intestine, we're into those portions we just learned earlier. Most of digestion and absorption occurs in the small intestine. So the first part is called the duodenum, the second portion is the jejunum, and the final portion is the ileum. So again, this is where most digestion and absorption of all our food and nutrients occurs, whether it's water or protein or fat. So how does digestion in the small intestine occur? Well, the small intestine needs a little bit of help. So remember, the beginning is our duodenum, so that's getting the stomach contents. But it also gets some secretions from the liver and the gallbladder called bile. Bile helps break down fat into smaller and smaller chunks and pieces and droplets. So we might call that emulsification. So that bile is going to be important in the ability of the small intestine to break down fats. The pancreas also secretes into that duodenum in the small intestine. The first thing that it secretes is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is going to be really important in neutralizing stomach acid. So remember, those little hydrogen ions are very acidic, and those are coming down into the duodenum from the stomach. But that bicarbonate from the pancreas will help neutralize it. The other thing that the pancreas secretes are pancreatic enzymes. These pancreatic enzymes are going to help digest fats, carbs, and proteins. Again, this is important for the small intestine to do its job. So thankfully, the liver and the pancreas help out that small intestine with bile and enzymes and bicarbonate. But the small intestine cells can make enzymes themselves. Those simple columnar epithelial cells in there make plenty of enzymes which help finish off the digestion. So let's look at carbohydrates or carbs first. We basically want to break down the carbs to monosaccharides or simple sugars like glucose and fructose. So we start with polysaccharides, carbohydrates. First we use amylase, and then we use a set of enzymes such as lactase, sucrase, and maltase, and we finally reach things like glucose, which we can absorb. Amylase and maltase, again, are enzymes. We get a little bit of amylase from our saliva, but most of the amylase is from the pancreas. The lactase, sucrase, and maltase are actually made by our little intestinal epithelial cells. In order to break down proteins or polypeptides, we're going to want to break those down to amino acids. The amino acids then can be absorbed. The types of enzymes that we'll need to break down proteins include peptidases, trypsin. Many of those are going to be from the pancreas or from our little intestinal cells. And we don't forget about pepsin from our stomach, which helps a bit too. For fats, we're going to want to break fats down from triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol, and then the fatty acids are packaged into these little things called micelles. So we're going to need we're going to need bile from our liver in order to break down that fat into smaller and smaller droplets, so that lipase, the digestive enzyme mainly from the pancreas, lipase is going to help break down that fat and triglyceride into its components that can be absorbed. So bile is helpful, and then lipase is the final step. I just wanted to mention that we ingest nucleic acids like DNA, and so we actually have enzymes like nucleases that can break down the DNA from plants and animals into nucleotides. So our cells want really, really simple stuff. And so we're going to need to break everything down to very simple things that can be absorbed now by our little small intestinal epithelial cells. So again, what are digestive enzymes? They're really just proteins that make things break apart. And we break apart everything using these series of enzymes until we go from, say, a protein to finally amino acids that can be absorbed. So enzymes are really just proteins themselves. And if we zoom in on the epithelium of our small intestine, we can see how absorption takes place. So as we zoom in, we see that we have simple columnar epithelium, and they're actually on these little ruffles called villi, which increases the surface area. But once you get the nutrients and the simple molecules through that simple columnar epithelium, they're basically inside your body. They've been absorbed. So glucose, for example, is taken up by transporter proteins. Those transporter proteins move the glucose by diffusion into the cell, and then it's eventually absorbed into capillaries and then circulates through the body. Similar with amino acids, they're moved through the cells through proteins, and then the amino acids are absorbed into our capillaries. Fats are a little different in that they're absorbed in these packages called micelles and picked up by our lymphatics and returned back to our circulation. So really it's all about membrane proteins absorbing these different nutrients and moving them across the cells and into your body. So absorption of all our little nutrients then makes it into our bloodstream. Most of that venous or all of that venous blood will go to our liver and then eventually back to our heart through the inferior vena cava. And then of course that blood then can circulate all around our body. First it stops in the lungs, but then it goes back to the heart and circulates throughout our body. What about absorbing things like water and ions like sodium and chloride and potassium? Well, it's very similar in that sodium will either be picked up by a channel or a transporter and then maybe pumped out of the back of the cell. So again, it just involves membrane proteins. Some of them require ATP, but you'll pick up that sodium, the chloride, the calcium, move it into the little epithelial cells, and then eventually into the bloodstream where it can circulate around the body. Water tends to follow these ions by osmosis, and water can either flow through channels into the cell or between the cells. But again, we absorb the water, which is attracted to all those little ions through osmosis. So now we have absorbed your ions, your calcium, your water. Sometimes we can't absorb things like, say, lactose, sugar. If you lack the right enzyme to digest it, it can give you diarrhea because basically the lactose stays in the tube and attracts water, which can cause diarrhea. Some bacteria can trigger diarrhea as well by making your little cells secrete sodium and chloride, which attracts water and again gives you diarrhea. This is a summary slide. I wouldn't expect you to be able to memorize it all right now during this video, but if you want to pause it, you can see the different nutrients and the enzymes that are needed to break those down. So this would be a good one to pause if you need to. What about the large intestine, or the colon as it's often called? The large intestine, mostly everything's digested by the time it gets to the large intestine, but it does a bit more absorption, adding to what's been done already by the small intestine. We also have bacteria, or gut bacteria, in our large intestine, and that gut bacteria is going to be helpful in doing a tiny bit of digestion, helping us get things that we normally couldn't digest ourselves. So we start in our large intestine, and then we end, of course, at the end of our large intestine, we already have feces that's stored up in our rectum. One of the things I wanted to mention is that fiber can stimulate mucus and motility in that large intestine. We also have our little appendix stuck on our large intestine as well. So we absorb some more water and we absorb some more ions in our large intestine. We also have our little gut bacteria, which can help liberate some vitamins and minerals and important things that normally we couldn't digest ourselves. And then finally, once the material reaches the end of our large intestine, it's compacted and we'd consider it feces at that point. If the water or ion absorption in the large intestine becomes disrupted, that can cause large amounts of diarrhea and water loss. What does the appendix do? We used to sometimes say nothing, but it probably has some role in the good gut bacteria and possibly also our defenses, since there's lots of lymphocytes. Some have suggested that perhaps the immune system is trained in there to recognize the good gut bacteria. I wanted to mention when some people on accident can ingest some bacteria or spores from bacteria that are bad gut bacteria that can actually take over your large intestine. This Clostridium difficile, or C. diff, is quite a problem, and because it can cause inflammation of the large intestine and some pretty bad diarrhea. Often it's hospital acquired, so this infection is encountered during your hospital stay. Again, it causes inflammation and it can cause severe diarrhea, making you very sick, especially if you're already sick in the hospital. So I just wanted to finish with a little bit about how do we regulate the activity of all these digestive organs using things like our autonomic nervous system, the enteric nervous system, which is the gut's own nervous system, as well as hormones, which can signal around different parts of the gut. So from, say, the duodenum to the stomach, or even the duodenum to the brain. So the autonomic nervous system allows the brain and spinal cord to send out commands to the digestive tract and digestive tube. We have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system activates the digestive system, whereas the sympathetic nervous system turns it down or turns its activity off. The autonomic nervous system interacts and controls our enteric nervous system when needed. The enteric nervous system is a local and regional nervous system inherent to the digestive tube itself. So it's pretty cool because the digestive system's so long, it really needs its own sort of nervous system to control things all by itself, independent of your brain and spinal cord. And then the digestive tract makes a lot of hormones. We're just going to learn some of them, but those hormones may signal to the brain or other digestive organs. For example, your duodenum, when it senses stomach acid in the duodenum, releases a hormone called secretin. Secretin then circulates around the entire body and really targets the pancreas to secrete more bicarbonate. So secretin tells that little pancreas and the cells to make more bicarbonate to neutralize that stomach acid. As partially digested food enters the duodenum, it actually releases a different hormone called CCK. And CCK then targets, for example, the pancreas to secrete more digestive enzymes to help digest that partially digested food that's entering the duodenum. CCK also stimulates the little gallbladder to contract and to secrete bile into the duodenum. And remember that bile will help in digestion of food as well, especially fat. So the duodenum is an example of an organ that makes hormones to regulate the other parts of the digestive tract. The autonomic nervous system is wired up throughout our digestive tract. It especially interacts with the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is more localized control, but the autonomic nervous system can then signal an input and let the brain can then let the enteric nervous system know what's going on. The enteric nervous system actually uses some of chemicals like acetylcholine, but some other ones like opioids and serotonin. I just wanted to mention contraction of the digestive tube and that muscularis externa is called motility. We have mixing motility called segmentation, and then movement motility called peristalsis, which kind of pushes the food along. So the advantage of having the autonomic nervous system and the enteric nervous system is you can have this local gut control through the enteric nervous system, but then also have the brain influence and regulate things when needed as well. So what about when it's time to go? And so basically you get signals from your rectum that it's distended, and that sends signals up to your brain. And then you actually have control of your skeletal muscle external anal sphincter. And when you relax that will actually set in motion a reflex, which involves smooth muscle layers of the rectum and the colon and that smooth muscle sphincter. So you consciously, voluntarily decide to relax your skeletal muscle sphincter, which then causes your autonomic and enteric nervous system to cause contraction of the rectum, which then causes defecation. And you may use your abdominal muscles to push that out too. If you have a spinal cord injury, you may lose voluntary control of defecation, but defecation can still occur. All right, that is it for the digestive system. I will see you guys in class.